So, Jonathan, I want you to imagine that aliens come down to Earth, in their big flying saucers.
Okay.
And the reason they're on Earth is because they want to drink some coffee. And right now, we're in the 1930s. They hover over New York, and then they get out these giant vacuum cleaners, which begin sucking.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they're tuned to suck only coffee beans. And so every roasted coffee bean in the world gets sucked up into like this giant spaceship. And then they brew a coffee and drink it.
Wow.
This is a world blend in the 1930s. I wonder what that cup would taste like.
Got you.
And now if we were to fast forward, almost 100 years till last year, what if those aliens came back to Earth and did the same thing?
Yeah.
Sucked up all the roasted coffee beans, made a world blend. What would that cup taste like, and how would it compare to the 1930s cup?
Okay, James, great thought experiment, but let's try it in real life. I got my friend Colin Smith, Smith's Coffee, to roast us up a 1930s blend and a 2020 blend.
So, Jonathan, 2 little silver bags came in the post, one labeled 1930, the other labeled 2020.
Yep.
And I've just ground them up in my Comandante, brewed them as a V60, and I have them in 2 little wine glasses side by side right in front of me right now.
I've put mine through the Sage grinder and I've made them into French presses.
Okay, let's taste.
Should we start in the 30s?
It's a bit nutty.
Yeah.
Baggy, stalish note to it.
Overwhelming characteristic is blandness.
I mean, it's not a bad coffee.
You take it in a hotel breakfast room.
So what is in this 1930s blend?
Number 1, overwhelmingly 60% Brazilian Santos.
So Brazil producing most of the coffee in the world in the 1930s. Let's fast forward to the world blend of last year.
Okay.
It's punchy, and I can get that distinct Robusta flavor in this coffee.
Absolutely. Okay, so Robusta is another species of coffee, and currently, of the Robusta, in the blend you're drinking, reflecting the world situation, 40% of it is made up of Robusta.
So 40% of world coffee production last year was not Arabica coffee, which was the only coffee variety found in the 1930s blend. But you're saying that as of last year, 40% of all coffee grown was not Arabica, but Robusta.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And in this episode, we're going to be exploring, as Robusta comes onto the world stage, no one government can control coffee anymore. The system gets so big that it moves in its own direction, pulled by market forces.
The history of this is the history of attempts to control and those attempts breaking down.
It sets us up for what I would describe as a pretty bleak situation at the end of the 20th century, where certifications and even specialty coffee think that, hey, we can come to the rescue here.
I think if we want to understand the last 20 years of the specialty revolution, then you've got to start with understanding this period and what's happening in the commodity market.
I'm James Harper, the creator of Filter Stories, a coffee documentary podcast.
I'm Jonathan Morris, Professor of History, author of Coffee, A Global History.
And this is A History of Coffee, a 6-episode series where we explore how a tiny psychoactive seed changed the world and shapes our lives today. So, Jonathan, let's pick up again from where we last left it in the story. We were at the tail end of the industrialization of coffee, where Brazil was producing vast amounts of coffee. Americans were drinking lakes of the stuff. And by the 1930s, Brazilians were burning it, dumping it in the sea. So what comes out of this vast oversupply of coffee?
Well, among the many things that the Brazilians tried was they commissioned a Swiss company to see if they could do something with coffee powder that could be preserved and kind of used in new ways. And then in 1938, came up with what we now know as Nescafé, soluble coffee. Now, let me be clear, not the first time that someone's produced soluble coffee. What's different is that it's instant coffee done on an industrial scale, and the other thing, to be blunt, is it's sort of palatable.
Okay, how do you make instant coffee?
Here's the very simple answer. You make the coffee, you then either evaporate and cool the coffee, or you spray the coffee around a freezing tower.
Right.
And wait for it to form down into little granules.
Huh.
You then break up the frozen coffee, a bit like it was a tray of toffee. They're now dry and they'll recompose when water is added to them.
There we go. Now, Jonathan, it's hard to overstate just how popular instant coffee becomes. I mean, I read things here and there that suggest that half of all coffee produced ends up being instant coffee. But why is instant coffee so popular?
It's so damn convenient, particularly if you think you know nothing about coffee. Now, if you're a consumer and you're pretty scared of coffee, and actually lots of consumers are, and as we said in the previous episode, a lot of advertising was designed to make consumers scared of coffee in the sense of, don't trust anything but us, don't try it yourself, don't do this, don't do that, just trust us. Well, this is the ultimate version of that, yeah? And indeed, that's how they market it. Nescafe has a beautiful piece of marketing. It's got mum with little girl, and the girl is making the coffee because it's child's play. It's now child's play to make coffee.
It's that simple.
It is that simple. There's a great story about Britain, and the takeoff of instant coffee coincides with the launch of commercial television. And why? Well, of course, you can make a cup of coffee in the time that the adverts are on, because all you've got to do is boil the kettle and sling the water on your instant coffee. And this is supposed to have also pushed the invention of the tea bag, as tea manufacturers realised they needed to come up with something that would enable them to win back some market share, because, otherwise everyone's going to switch into coffee. The other thing that it spawns is it's much easier to go to a non-traditional coffee market with a product like that and say, hey, coffee, it's dead simple, just add water, than it is to go and teach people how to use a French press or a filter, to grind their own coffee, any of that kind of stuff.
So, of course, instant coffee is easy to use, but also it's so much cheaper per cup.
Correct.
So do some back-of-the-envelope maths. If you buy a pack of roasted ground coffee in the supermarket, your cup of coffee in the morning will be about 25 cents. But that same cup of coffee with instant coffee costs about 5 cents.
Ow.
5 times less.
Yeah.
And at 5 cents a cup of coffee, I'm going to go out on a limb and say a lot of the world can now afford a cup of instant coffee at least once in a while.
Yes, absolutely.
So instant coffee, it is now incredibly popular. What kind of coffee is in there?
Instant coffee, as we said, the aim is cheapness. Cheap coffee, Robusta coffee.
Now, Robusta itself is a pretty hardy little plant. It can grow at much lower altitudes. It also produces a lot more coffee cherry. But why not Arabica coffee? I mean, I know Arabica coffee made up the majority of our world blend in the 1930s. Why can't the world, continue growing Arabica? Why does it switch to Robusta?
This is a critical point in the world history of coffee. As Brazil became that big industrial producer,
right,
Asia, the other big producer, saw its coffee growing pretty much wiped out by coffee rust disease.
And what is coffee leaf rust?
It's a fungus, and it kills them slowly. And as a result, Asia went from maybe producing about a third of the world's coffee in 1850, perhaps a bit more, to producing pretty much zilch.
Wow.
So the only way to get production back there was to find a rust-resistant, hardier form of coffee. What happened was they adopted Robusta, and this is what is used to replant. So it's not switching from Arabica, it's adding to Arabica.
Right.
And it's adding to the total stock of world coffee. So if we look at the amount of coffee grown in the world now, it's much, much higher than in the 1930s. But 40% of that coffee is Robusta.
Wow. So here we have Robusta, this hardy little coffee plant. It can grow at much lower elevations. So who steps up on the world stage to grow it?
I'll tell you where it's very popular, James, and that's in West Africa.
Right.
These post-colonial countries look to coffee and Robusta coffee as a way of getting an export crop quickly that they can get money for.
Right.
So, I mean, Ivory Coast is a good example. The Ivory Coast president, Houphouët-Boigny, was a coffee grower. I'm going to say what he said. Dear Africans, dear Ivorians, don't just vegetate in your bamboo huts. Grow coffee and make money. He was saying, grow coffee. This will enrich us and it will enrich you. And I've got to say, it did.
Huh.
Houphouët-Boigny, he sort of was on the side of the coffee grower. The way of measuring that is that he gave the coffee growers back most of the price for the coffee that was obtained on the export market.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, this is the critical thing, because all of these countries basically use a scheme whereby all the coffee has to be sold to the state by the farmer, and the state exports it, through various boards.
Right.
Now, that's okay if the state gives you a good price for your coffee.
Right.
But it's disastrous when the state decides it wants more and more of the money and it doesn't give it you back.
Do we have an example of that?
We absolutely have an example of that, Uganda. Now, Uganda is actually in East Africa, and post-independence, Uganda began again growing a lot of Robusta coffee.
Oh, okay.
Now, that was fine, and Uganda developed quite a strong reputation for good Robusta. Then a guy called Idi Amin came to power in Uganda. This is the guy who was just a horrendous dictator. I mean, he tortured people all the time in most appalling ways that I really wouldn't want to describe. So in the 70s, when, Amin is at the height of his power, he is giving those peasants 20%
Wow.
of the price of the coffee that he is receiving. I would say there was 0 point in growing coffee, except, of course, if you didn't grow coffee and surrender it to the state, you would find yourself in unbelievable troubles in other ways.
Wow.
So it broke the coffee system in Uganda.
So what happened to coffee growing in Uganda?
Declined enormously, lost quality. It's only really in the 21st century that Uganda has started to really revive as a coffee growing country.
Okay, so Jonathan, right, so Africa steps up into the world stage and becomes a large producer of Robusta coffee.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Now, of course, we're talking about height of the Cold War.
Of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
We had nuclear missiles on Cuba aimed at the United States.
Each of these missiles is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral.
There were civil wars going on in Central America. Everyone was talking about, the left-wing revolutionaries. So how does this all play out in the world of coffee?
Basically, what happens is that the Latin American producers and their governments are not afraid to use that and the very real threat that they feel they're under to try and persuade the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, to pay them better prices for coffee. There's a Colombian senator who gets up after the Cuban Revolution and speaks to, I think it's the US Senate, and he says, if you don't pay us good prices for our coffee, God help us all, the masses will become one great Marxist revolutionary army that will sweep us all into the sea.
Wow.
This is the language that they are using back at the US to say, listen, you've got to stump up here, otherwise we're in trouble. And if we're in trouble, you're ultimately in trouble.
Wow.
You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So the big outcome of this is something called the International Coffee Agreement. Effectively, it allows producer countries to create a cartel.
And Jonathan, quickly, what is a cartel?
So a cartel is a group of producers that between them control enough of the market. So instead of being competitive, a cartel basically says, look, if we produce most of the world's whatever, we can actually set the price and you're going to have to take it.
And that's what happens in oil among OPEC countries. They say, hey, the price of oil is too low. Let's just produce a lot less. The world needs our oil. They're going to pay a lot more for it.
Yeah, you pay the price that we're going to ask for, or we won't give you the oil. Now, American politicians are not usually very favourable to cartels. But this one is approved by the US and becomes almost central to US foreign policy.
Unbelievable.
When do they push it through Congress? Right with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that's exactly, the kind of incentive to say, well, hey, yeah, you probably do need to do this, because otherwise we really could be in trouble.
So basically, coffee-producing countries came together and said, we are going to be restricting output. By the way, America, this is not good for Americans because now you're going to have to spend more for your coffee. But you know what? That's a small price to pay to not have revolutionaries flooding across the border.
Well, you've exactly hit it on the head there. And yeah, the International Coffee Organization, within the context of the Cold War, is seen as an American-sponsored institution because the American foreign policy says, we cannot have Marxist-inspired governments in Latin America. We cannot have these people on our borders. So, yeah, we've got to do something to just keep that price of coffee, which just keeps the economies of these countries in a stable enough orbit that they shouldn't turn communist. Throughout the 1980s, we're talking the Reagan years, and through all that period, the US still props up the ICA.
Reagan himself, the founder of Reaganomics, props up the ICA, a cartel which is bad for American consumers.
Absolutely. But the thing about that, James, is as soon as the Cold War is over, bang, down it goes. No more renewal of the ICA.
As soon as the Soviet Union collapses.
So as soon as the Soviet Union collapses, then so does the ICA collapse.
Okay, so the ICA is predominantly a cartel for Arabica coffee production, right?
So this is an interesting one. So the ICA organized its internal democracy by giving the biggest countries in terms of production the biggest number of votes.
Right.
So Brazil gets the biggest number of votes, followed by Colombia. And essentially, if Brazil and Colombia agree on something, it's pretty much that's it.
Right.
The other thing to understand about this, James, is that when they come to drawing up quota, they draw up 4 different types of coffee and the quota for them. And those 4 different types are given the following names. Brazilian naturals, that's the biggest category. By and large, therefore, just sun-dried Brazilian commodity coffee. Right. Then what they call Colombian milds, which are Arabicas, predominantly Colombia, with the best sort of taste, the ones that you use to kind of perk your blend. Other milds, which include the other Arabica things, and then Robusta. So Robusta is your last category. Robusta is the cheapest category. Right? And Robusta is locked in a cheap price. Now, it's locked in a cheap price, which is substantively below Arabica.
Right.
Robusta is literally the poor cousin of Arabica.
So you're saying right from the get-go, a lower price is codified into the cartel. For all concerned, Robusta is an inferior product. Thank you very much.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so Jonathan, I want to take us now to the early 90s, and we have a much sadder state of affairs on the coffee market.
Yeah.
I mean, first things first, that international coffee agreement is dead. But what does the death of the ICA, the International Coffee Agreement, what does it do to coffee prices?
Well, allow me to give you a stat, okay? 1984 to 1988, the overall price for coffee per pound, using prices of the time, $1.34.
Okay, $1.34 per pound for coffee in the mid-80s.
1989 to 93, after the ending of the agreement, 77 cents.
Jeez. Yeah, just collapse.
There's your crisis. And that leaves many coffee farmers to indeed leave the land. It leads to great poverty. It leads, therefore, to many to migrate, leads to political instability. And you can see why. I mean, what's that? That's about 50% fall, isn't it, pretty much?
Yeah, I mean, $1.34 to 77 cents. Could you imagine going to, let's say, a quarter of the people, in the country in which you live, and then all of a sudden, slash their incomes by half? What's that going to do?
Yeah, exactly.
So, Jonathan, that crash in the coffee price in the early 90s, I mean, it was basically driven by the ICA falling apart. But then just 10 years later, the coffee price crashes again. But this time, a lot of people blame one specific country.
I was at a coffee conference in the early 2000s where we had farmers from Central America. Mm-hmm. It was the height of the coffee price crisis. And somebody said to this guy, "What's your biggest problem?" And he just stood up and said, "Vietnam." And sat down again.
So, Jonathan, why did this man from Colombia stand up in the audience and say Vietnam is the problem? What had happened with Vietnam and coffee by the year 2000?
Vietnam, as a regime, discovered coffee as a way of solving a particular problem. It was a problem about post-war pacification.
Let's go to the end of the Vietnam War. We're talking, early 70s.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a small, Vietnamese peasant farmer. What's going on for them?
We need to think about two sets of peasant farmers here, James. The peasant farmers who are actually living in the area that we now call the Central Highlands.
Okay.
The war has basically been fought over this area.
Wow.
So they have now been occupied by, as it were, the North Vietnamese.
Uh-huh.
And the North Vietnamese don't trust them.
Huh. Oftentimes the Vietnam War is seen as, America versus Vietnam.
Yeah.
But it's actually a civil war.
It's very much a civil war because what you have is a population in the Central Highlands region. So these people have probably little loyalty to either regime. The South Vietnamese regime was a fairly corrupt, kleptocratic state. Mm-hmm. The North Vietnamese regime is this communist, socialist operation. Mm-hmm. These people really, the original inhabitants, are probably have very little loyalty to either side, but it's their land that gets destroyed and fought through, that they're getting the American bombs, that they're getting the occupation from the North, that they're getting treated pretty appallingly by both sides because neither side trusts them. Huh. And I'm afraid it gets no better for them once the war is officially over. Because what happens is that the new Vietnamese government, that's to say, the North Vietnamese government,
right,
because it doesn't trust them, it resettles that land with a lot more supposedly loyal peasantry, moves them down, and sets up these big agricultural cooperatives, the kind of state collective farms. And that's where they start using coffee as one of those crops that's on those farms.
Imagine you're a North Vietnamese peasant and, the war's just finished and the government is like, hey, come to the middle of Vietnam. Here's some land. Here's some coffee trees. Plant this coffee. Go for it.
Let me correct you.
Right.
Okay, so James, the first thing is that it's not nearly as nice as that.
Oh.
Okay. These people are transplanted in. I'm not sure that they have that much choice. Now, given that they probably have very little resource, then they'll probably take it.
Okay.
And the idea is that from the government is that they'll be grateful for having just simply the sort of, economic security of being on the farm. Effectively a farm employee, a state employee working on a farm.
And where does Vietnam sell this coffee? Because, the North Vietnamese regime is a communist regime. I mean, I can't imagine a communist Vietnamese government having a seat with America at the ICA.
Yeah, there is a growing market of those states that are not part of the ICA that are, trying to improve their consumer experience for their citizens. So I'm thinking of countries like East Germany, the Eastern Soviet bloc and so forth.
So let me be clear. This North Vietnamese peasant ends up in the Central Highlands, grows coffee, gives the coffee to the government because it's part of a collectivized system. The Vietnamese government then goes onto the world market being like, who wants this coffee? They're outside of the ICA. They can't sell within that system. So they say, well, who's not part of the ICA? let's say, East Germany,
Exactly.
part of the Soviet sphere of influence. They needed coffee. Let's sell to them.
But then remember, of course, that from the early 90s, things begin to change. The ICA falls apart. Vietnam starts liberalizing its economy. And by liberalizing its economy, it starts transferring, through various schemes, coffee growing and land into private hands. And the outcome of that is that by 2000, 90% of the coffee growing land in Vietnam is now in private hands. So it's a major transformation.
So Vietnam privatizes its production of Robusta coffee. What does that do to how much Robusta coffee it grows?
To give you some scale for Vietnam, 1990 to 91, the country produced 1.3 million bags of coffee. That's a hell of a lot more than the probably 150 bags it was producing in the 70s, but it's not a massive amount. 2000 to 2001, it's at 14.8 million bags. 2015 to 2016, that's at 28.7 million bags.
What does that even mean? What does this even mean?
Well, what that means, to give you a sense, at 28.7 million bags, Vietnam produces more coffee than the entirety of Africa.
Wow.
At that point. And what it means in terms of Vietnam's status is Vietnam is the second biggest coffee producer in the world.
Now, of course, we have these price crises in the early 90s and the late 90s. Do they affect Vietnam?
Robusta experiences that price crisis in a way that's even greater than Arabica. Robusta price falls from 83 cents in 1998 to 28 cents in 2001.
28 cents for a pound of coffee. That's literally less than 1 cent per cup of coffee.
In the Central Highlands, we know that probably 30% of the population at that time actually suffered from hunger and malnutrition.
And so, let's go back into the room where you were, where that Colombian farmer stood up and they said, "What's your problem?" And the Colombian farmer said, "Vietnam."
Yeah.
Why was he pointing to Vietnam as the problem?
He's angry because the huge expansion of production in Vietnam means that the overall price of coffee falls and falls significantly, disastrously, in fact. And because if you're a massive coffee roaster, then you will buy the cheap coffee and blend it or do things with it. So, for example, Robusta coffee, one thing you can do to make it slightly more palatable is steam clean it.
How does that work?
You stack the coffee in a tower and you introduce steam through it. It cleans it up a bit, makes it a little bit more palatable. So to get back to our farmer, his problem is that with all this coffee available from Vietnam and with it being used as part of a blend to reduce the price of the blend in the final product, then his coffee is worth less. There's less demand for it, and unless he drops the price, there'll be less and less demand for it.
So you're saying that this Robusta coffee, it is, for example, being steam cleaned because the flavors aren't of the same quality as an Arabica coffee. I mean, that's why you got to steam clean it, to kind of take out the undesirable flavors.
Yeah, commodity Robusta does not taste great. I mean, the very fact that we could think about steam cleaning a load of coffee tells you how much it needs improvement.
Right. And big coffee roasters, they roast coffee by the metric ton. And what they need, this is classic capitalism, reduce your costs. How do you do it? Well, reduce the cost of your beans. So here's the Arabica price at X, and here's the Robusta. It's lower than X. It's cheaper.
Yeah.
So that's why this Colombian farmer was so angry, is because his commodity Arabica coffee was now competing with this much cheaper Robusta coffee, which had an inferior taste, but the end customers didn't know the difference.
In essence, yes, because the end customer just buys the can off the shelf.
But this is it to me. Like, didn't drinkers notice that the quality of coffee had gone from commodity Arabica to steam clean Robusta? Didn't anyone notice? Didn't anyone like kick up a fuss?
Actually, no. And indeed, throughout the end of the century, it's almost like a little game of chicken here as big roasters sort of put more and more Robusta into their blend and see if they can get away with it. What will be the price-taste trade-off? Will their consumers really notice?
I mean, Jonathan, if we just take a step back and look at the broad historical trends here, I just think back to the Yemeni farmer on the mountainside growing their, delicious coffee. And then along come Europeans, slavery. That dramatically lowers the price. Again, you fast forward a bit, you have the emergence of Brazil, industrialization, the cutting of rainforests. The price goes down, but who's the victim here? Well, arguably the environment. And then you fast forward again, 100 years or so. Instant coffee comes onto the world stage. Instant coffee made mostly with Robusta coffee.
Yeah.
And Robusta can be produced cheap. The ICA even locked in a cheap price for it. We have almost the entire world able to afford a cup of coffee.
Yes.
Then the Cold War ends and the ICA has fallen apart.
Yeah.
Vietnam is now on the stage as the second largest coffee producer in the world. And it's now got to a point where, governments are unable to coordinate amongst themselves to keep the coffee price high.
Yeah.
So the supply side has now taken on a life of its own. And now let's look at the consuming side. Let's say you're a consumer of coffee in America, in the 90s. You go down to your supermarket and, there's the coffee presented to you. You can choose different brands, but they all come from this commodity system. Consumers' habits are to, maybe put milk and sugar into a coffee. So it really doesn't matter as much to them what those flavors are in the cup.
And the other thing to add here, James, is of course, you get habituated to the coffee you grow up with, as it were, or the coffee that you habitually drink. So that becomes for you the taste of coffee.
But what that means is that as long as consumers think that coffee is coffee and it's interchangeable, then there's really no one who can control this global commodity system of production and consumption. And what that means is that the money you can earn as a coffee farmer is at the complete mercy of a market which has a life of its own. And if you are one of the millions of smallholder coffee farmers who grow the majority of coffee in the world, you live in a developing country, you have very low education, you have very few ways of making money outside of coffee. And if this system by itself ends up in a place where coffee prices are low and you are not earning enough money to support your family, there's not much you can do about it.
I think you could sum it up with this dilemma. You're a coffee producer. Your income is declining because the price is dropping. Your response, which seems rational, is to grow more coffee. If I can only make 1 cent instead of 2 cents on my coffee per pound, then I need to grow twice as much coffee. But of course, what you're doing is just further growing the world supply of coffee, which further suppresses the price, because I can always go even more now to look for somebody else who'll do it cheaper.
This is a race to the bottom.
Absolutely.
And this is kind of scary because this coffee system has a life of its own now. And are we comfortable with this being a race to the bottom?
The reaction to that we'll see in the last sort of 20 years is what we're going to talk about in the next 2 episodes.
We are going to look at attempts by people who don't like the system as it is to change it.
We're looking at the ways in which people have been desperately seeking sustainability.
So thank you for listening to this 4th episode of A History of Coffee. If you are interested in also tasting the 1930s and the 2020 blend that we tasted at the top of the episode, we could actually try and organize that with our friend Colin Smith over at Smith's Coffee. So get in touch on social media. I'm at Filter Stories Podcast.
I'm at Coffee History JM.
And we'll try and organize something for you. And there's also a link to future episodes, which haven't even dropped yet, of A History of Coffee on the A History of Coffee channel. So click on that link and subscribe.
And while you're there, check out my book, Coffee: A Global History. And can I remind people that I'm offering a copy of the book to anyone who has dropped a review of the podcasts. Send us a screenshot and we'll put you into a draw and you'll get a free copy of the book.
Don't forget to send that screen grab to me, hello@filterstories.org. This podcast was produced by yourself and myself, and I wrote and played the piano music.
You did indeed. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll speak to you in the next episode.